Welcome to COM 4740 Intercultural Communication, Chapter 5, Identity and Intercultural Communication. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at the relationship between our personal sense of identity and the culture of which we are a part. And we'll be looking at this through three different lenses: the social science, interpretive, and critical, just as we've been doing all semester and will continue to do throughout the textbook. We're going to talk about this topic through these three ideas or three methods of study. So we'll take them one at a time on the following slides, beginning with the social science perspective. The social science perspective on identity suggests that we create a self and then display it to others. This is the idea of the performative self, which is discussed at length by scholar Erving Goffman in his book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, which is pictured here. This idea would suggest that we have a front stage self and a backstage self. Our backstage self is the stuff that we hide from most people, that we consider highly personal. Think of what the backstage of a theater looks like if you've ever experienced that. There might be props laying around and you can see the backside, the mechanical side of the lighting equipment and how the curtains work and things like that. It's a perspective that is not meant to be shared with the audience, but your front stage self is meant to be shared with the audience. That's when you go out and you perform a persona. So the social science perspective would suggest that each of us thinks about how we want to appear to others and how we want to enter the world, and then we will strive to go out into the world and perform that created persona. And I imagine that you can see this working in your own life when you think about something like having to make a speech or a presentation and being very nervous, but you say to yourself, I'm going to go out there and perform confidence, even though that's not what I'm feeling. So you would be keeping your nerves backstage and showing confidence, putting on a face of confidence to the rest of the world. That would be the social science perspective. The emphasis here is on the individual self and the idea that we create an identity that we want others to get to know us by and understand us by. The interpretive perspective suggests that our sense of identity is formed through interaction and communication with others. So it's not just that we decide on how we want to be seen and go out there and perform it, but that others react to that and that we reflect on their interaction and maybe adjust our sense of self based on the way that they're reacting toward us. So there's a back and forth in this, and our sense of self is a work in process that we're constantly making adjustments to based on the way others react to us. And there is an emphasis in the interpretive perspective on the avowal and ascribed dimensions of identity. There is a video in the supplemental videos and readings folder on e-learning about a Muslim woman explains why she wears the veil. And if you watch that, you'll get a great example of avowal and ascription. Avowal is what you would say about yourself or what you believe about yourself. Ascription is what other people would say or believe about you. So what you would notice in that video is that this woman explaining why she wears the veil, that is her avowal. That is her sense of who she is and how she wants to present in the world. But she also mentions other people's ascriptions toward her, that outsiders looking at her and looking at her wearing the veil are interpreting who she is in their own way. That is ascription. And sometimes the avowal and the ascription are in conflict, as they are here. She's saying, this is why I do it, and this is my sense of self, but here's what other people think of me, and here's their sense of who I am. So avowal versus ascription. Now, the interpretive perspective would suggest that we continually grapple with and adjust our sense of self based on this interplay between avowal and ascription. So when you watch the video, try to identify each of those words, those concepts in what the woman is explaining to us. And thirdly, we have the critical perspective. Now you'll recall that the critical perspective always has to do with issues of power imbalances, injustices, racial identities, and things like that. You're always looking for those roots of conflict in a given situation. So the critical perspective would suggest that our sense of identity is shaped by social and historical forces, which are often oppressive. So our sense of identity is shaped by things like social privilege versus social disadvantage, our socioeconomic class, our race and how others react to it, and elements like that. It emphasizes the contextual and conflicting aspects of identity that we struggle with. And a good example of this that I can describe to you is the book pictured here, Borderlands. Borderlands La Frontera, the New Mestiza by Gloria Anzaldúa. And Gloria Anzaldúa grew up on the border between Texas and Mexico, and she is half Mexican, half American. And in this book, she explains how she felt like a half person in each world, how neither culture fully accepted her as their own. And so she had one foot in each of these different cultures, one foot in Mexican culture and one foot in American culture. And interestingly, the book is written in a mixture of English and Spanish. And not being a Spanish speaker myself, my second language is French. The first time I read this book, I got frustrated in many places because I'd be reading along and then she'd switch into Spanish, and I had to really reflect on why I didn't like that, why it actually made me angry at times, because I wanted to hear what she was saying, but she was expressing it in a language that I don't understand. And that was exactly what she was trying to do. That was her point. Her point was that I'm a hybrid and I switch back and forth between these worlds, and neither world can fully understand me because of that. So she found out that her identity was very split, and neither Americans nor Mexicans accepted her fully. So it's an interesting take on that critical perspective, that her sense of identity of not quite belonging in either culture was shaped by a lot of history and a lot of cultural conflict between two different groups that she was kind of caught in the middle of and had one foot in each culture. So let's look at the elements that make up our own sense of identity. The most important ones we call salient identity characteristics. Something that's salient is important, is essential, something like that. So you might have a lot of different factors in your identity, but some are more salient to you than others, more foregrounded, more important. So let's look at a number of identity characteristics and talk about how salient they might be to each of us. Let's look at this list of identity characteristics, and as we do, think about which ones are most salient to you, meaning which ones are the most important to your own sense of self. We can start with age. We can talk about what generation you come from. If you are a millennial or a Gen Xer or something in between. These different age groups tend to have certain personality traits or values associated with them, and some of us identify with that more than others. Some will say, oh, I'm a millennial, so I think this way. Others don't find it that important. Gender is another one. The great majority of us identify with a particular gender, and that may or may not be something that's very important to your sense of self. I would say that gender is probably a very salient identity characteristic to transgender people because they've had to grapple with the differences between genders and how those are perceived by others. Also, women who are strongly involved in women's rights might find their gender to be a very salient identity characteristic, but for some of us it might not matter as strongly. Sexual orientation. In general, heterosexuality is considered the default in our culture. I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that is something we can observe in the world around us, that seems to be the default. But if you are not heterosexual, your sexual orientation might be more salient to you for the same reason as gender can be for some people, meaning if you don't fit the cultural norm or what culture is telling you should be the norm, you think about it more perhaps and grapple with it more, and it becomes more of a foregrounded part of your sense of self. Race is another one. Whether you consider your origins, your skin color to be an important part of your identity, again, depends on what that race is probably. The institutionalized default in our culture tends to be whiteness. Again, I'm not saying that's right, but that seems to be what's considered the default. So everything else is contrasted with whiteness, if that makes sense. So if you are a person of color, your race might be a more salient part of your identity than a white person's race is to the white person. Ethnicity, kind of a subset of race. Ethnic groups practice certain cultural habits, like the eating of certain foods, the engagement in certain kinds of pursuits like music or storytelling or things like that. Ethnic identities can be very salient to the people who hold them. Religious identities. Again, if you grew up in a deeply religious culture, if you yourself are deeply religious, it might be a very important part of your sense of self. If you did not grow up with religious training and have never really sought religious information or explored religion very much, because it's not something that's personally important to you, then it might not be a strong part of your identity. Now, I'm going to tell you a little story that will illustrate the race and religion thing and how those can be salient to us or not. A colleague of mine had a student, an international student, who was having trouble making friends, and so the professor got this idea that he would take this student to the registered student organizations area because he knew that there were RSOs for students from different countries or regions, and he thought if this student could join a student organization for students from his area of the world, that he would find friends there. So he took the student there, introduced him, left him there. A while later, he asked the student, "Did you join that group?" And the student told him, "No, actually, I joined a different group that was, a couple doors down from that. It was a religious group that was meeting regularly to have religious discussions and religious studies and things like that." And this professor realized that he had assumed that this young man's race was his salient identity characteristic, but it turned out to be his religion was more salient than his race or ethnicity. So we can easily make these mistakes looking at someone from the outside. You might look at a woman of color and think that she's more concerned about racial issues than she is about women's issues, and might find out that you're wrong about that, that maybe her race is not as strongly salient to her as her gender is. These can bump up against each other in the ways that we look at each other, the ways we ascribe. Remember that word from the last slide, ascription, the ways we interpret other people. So let's continue on with our list. Socioeconomic class. Most of us have an idea of what socioeconomic class we belong to, whether we're lower, middle, or upper class. Some societies have caste systems. Some societies have ranks of nobility, and people of varying ranks tend to look up or down upon each other. So how important is your socioeconomic class to your sense of self? Now, for many of us who would be considered middle class is, again, one of those kind of neutral defaults that people don't really identify strongly with because it's just the kind of established as a social norm. So if you're middle class, you might not have thought about it very much. This leads to problems when we talk about privilege, because sometimes middle class people have difficulty recognizing their privilege because they feel like, well, I'm not rich and I'm working hard for what I have. So our own sense of where our socioeconomic class places us in relation to others can be complicated. National identity. This is an interesting one. The United States is thought of as a very patriotic nation, so we very strongly identify, for the most part, as being American. It is not the same in other parts of the world, and some of those other cultures look at our patriotism with a raised eyebrow. It seems a little odd to them. I have been told that, for example, in Germany, you don't see people flying the German flag outside their homes. In a lot of European countries, you don't get that sense of nationalism that you do here. I had a European friend one time ask me, when there's a sporting event, why do you sing to your flag before it starts? And I said, what do you mean? She says, well, someone will carry the flag out onto the field and then you all put your hand over your heart and sing to the flag. What does that mean? And I explained, well, we're not singing to the flag, we're singing of our love for our nation. But I could understand why that practice might seem strange to someone who comes from a culture that doesn't have that sense of nationalism that we do, and finding it hard to understand these controversies about kneeling versus putting one's hand over one's heart and things like that. Those don't make sense to people from places that don't have the strong sense of nationalism that we do. So that's an interesting thing to think about. How is your sense of nationalism salient to you or not? Regional identity. We know that different regions of the country can have really strong regional identities, like the American South or the Pacific Northwest or the Pacific Southwest or the Great Lakes region. People are often very proud to be from those places. They speak regional dialects and things like that. So that may or may not be a salient part of your identity. If you've moved around a lot, especially, it might not be that important to you. Whereas if you were born and raised in a certain place and plan to live out your life there, your regional identity might be very important to you. And you can probably think of a lot of other identity characteristics that might be stronger or weaker for different people. Things like following certain hobbies, belonging to certain organizations, things like that, and how the mixture of these can come into conflict. And we're going to misjudge sometimes which ones are the most salient to the person that we are looking at or that we are conversing with. So, how do you enter the world in a way that you can be authentically known and you can perform your most salient identity characteristics so that other people know what those are? That's something to think about. It comes through self-disclosure. People can usually tell visually what age group you belong to, perhaps what your race or gender is, things like that. They can make a judgment on just by a glance. But what is most important to you? If your religious identity is most salient to you, or perhaps your regional identity, those are things you're going to have to self-disclose to other people. And if you want to be truly known by somebody and you want to enter the world authentically, you're going to need to self-disclose on those most important identity characteristics so that other people will react to you in the ways that you hope they will. So here are some takeaways to remember from our discussion about salient identities. First, we are all multicultural and co-cultural beings. We all have a foot in more than one kind of culture. You might have a foot in religious culture and a foot in academic culture, or you might have a foot in racial culture and your other foot is in gender culture. So we all have a variety of aspects to our sense of self. Saliency varies from person to person. We make assumptions that these three people who all care about racial justice might have race as their most salient identity characteristic, but it might not be at the top of the list for all three of those people. So we can misjudge that. Saliency can be situational. Your cultural identity, your religious identity, your gender identity might be more important to you in a particular context than it is at other times in your life. For example, when you're sitting in class versus when you are being introduced to someone new versus when you are interacting with a friend. Those can be performed differently. And saliency can change over time. The things that are the most important part of your sense of self right now might not continue to be the most important over a lifetime. Others might rise to the top. For example, if you are not a parent right now, being a parent is not part of your salient identity. If you are raising newborn twins, as is one of my former students right now, she just had twin little girls, I'm sure parenthood is the most salient of her identities at this moment. So as we evolve over a lifetime, that list and the rankings of what's on our list is going to change. On page 181 of our text, our authors explain 4 stages of minority identity development. And this is a stage model for a thought process that a person goes through when they discover that they are in a social minority. They discover that they are not behaving or thinking or acting in a way that is expected by their culture, and how you come to grips with the idea that you are not following the conventional expectations. So in order to go through this discussion, let's use an example of non-cis sexual identity as our minority status. Now, if you don't know what that means, I'll give a brief explanation here. If someone is cissexual, it means that they think and act and behave in the expected and conventional way for their gender. Okay, so it would mean that a cissexual woman is attracted to men, a cissexual man is attracted to women. That is considered a cultural default. So for this discussion, we're going to use non-cis sexual identity for our example or for our minority status. So that would be people who fall into or identify with the LGBTQ plus cultural group. Okay, so non-cis, non-heterosexual, basically. We're going to use that as the minority status for our examination of this model of minority identity development. And our authors suggest that a person goes through 4 stages in coming to grips with the fact that they're part of a minority group and will be looked at as being different. And those 4 stages are unexamined identity, conformity, resistance and separatism, and integration. And we'll take each of those one by one in the moments ahead. So beginning with the first stage of minority identity development, it's called unexamined identity. This is a very early stage where the person is maybe not even aware that they're different. They're not interested in the issue, and they accept the values of the majority culture. So you could think of this as perhaps a small child who is not heterosexual but has not discovered that yet, who doesn't know what that means yet, and is at a stage where they're just accepting the values of the majority culture without questioning them. The second stage of minority identity development, according to our authors, is called conformity. So at this stage, the person starts to realize that they are different in some way, but they internalize it. They're not talking about it or showing it to other people. They're engaging in passive or active acceptance of the rules. They try to assimilate and they try to pass for whatever is considered normal or mainstream in the culture around them. The third stage of minority identity development, again, according to our authors, is called resistance and separatism. And at this stage, the person fully realizes that they're different from the so-called norm or what the culture expects. They start to rebel against the dominant culture and to value their own group. So this is a stage where our non-cis person might, quote unquote, come out. They might start to hang around with people that they identify with as part of a subculture. They might rebel and speak against the dominant culture. In other words, be vocal about the idea that heterosexuality should not be the only norm and that they should not be repressed or looked down on in any way. So there might be an activism element to this stage of resistance and separatism. Now, in the process of minority identity development, some people kind of land at this stage, right? It's the third of 4, but they might stay here. They start to value their own group. They realize they're different and they resist the dominant culture. They can, you can be very happy here. You can feel that you are self-actualized here. But there is one further stage that you can attain according to this model. The fourth stage of the minority identity development model then is integration. And the integration stage, this is a fully realized person. This is a person who has a strong sense of self, a strong sense of their identity. They're comfortable with themselves. They're reconciled with who they are. They've reconciled any previous issues that they grappled with along the way and are willing to live authentically and enter the world authentically, but not in a contentious way necessarily. This is kind of a self-actualized stage where a person becomes comfortable with who they are and with behaving as they are. So now that we know what these stages of minority identity development are, we can use it to examine other minority groups. For example, let's take the idea of someone who is extremely religious and follow it through here. Step one might be unexamined identity. They're not aware of religious issues. They don't pay much attention to it around them. Then when they start having strongly religious feelings, they might engage in conformity. They might keep quiet about it. They might continue to behave in ways that religious people might frown upon, but they want to fit in with the mainstream group. Then they might come to the stage of resistance and separatism, where they're willing to own who they are and speak out about it. It could be contentious. They might tend to restrict their social interaction to people who think as they do. And then the fourth stage of integration might be where this person has reached a point where their religion is deeply personally meaningful to them, and it's a part of their sense of self and a part of their authentic self, but they're comfortable with how they feel. They might be becoming comfortable with the fact that other people don't feel the same way. They may no longer feel the need to be contentious about it. It's kind of a self-actualized stage of belonging to a minority. There are a number of other identities that are discussed in this chapter. Please read those sections carefully. I wanted to touch on 3 of them here. The first is global nomads. Global nomads are also sometimes known as third culture kids. These are people who moved around a lot as children and therefore were exposed to a lot of different cultures at a young age. So think about kids whose parents are in the military who've had to move to different countries and be the new kid in school over and over and over again. That would be an example of global nomads. They've moved around a lot and have sampled a lot of different cultures. And think about the ways in which that would play into your own sense of identity and the way that you judge and think about other people. Culture brokers are people who serve as a go-between. So think about maybe you grew up in the US, you did a study abroad in Japan, now you're back in the US, and you are helping American and Japanese people to understand each other. You're acting as a go-between, a liaison, a representative of both in trying to bring people together and create understanding between people. And then hybrid identities. Hybrids, again, people who have one foot in one culture and one foot in another culture. Gloria Anzaldúa, who wrote that book Borderlands, the Mexican-American woman I was talking about, she would be a hybrid. Or a Chinese-American person who has Chinese parents and yet goes out into the American workplace every day and is interacting in both cultures and having perhaps to change their behavior and language and the way they dress in each of those cultural groups would be called a hybrid. And hybrids would be engaging in something called code switching, which we will cover more in the future. So someone who is part one thing and part another thing would be classified as a hybrid. As we make ascriptions to other people, we often go through a stereotyping process in our minds. And when I talk about stereotyping, a lot of people cringe because they think, oh, stereotyping's bad and you should never do it. But our brains are wired up to do it. And so if we understand the process our minds are going through, we can interrupt that process at the point where it starts to go in a bad direction. So I'm going to take you through the 4 steps of stereotyping and explain how to recognize where it can possibly go wrong or can lead us to prejudice. So step 1, someone catches your attention for whatever reason. Let's say you're walking across campus and you notice a young man walking along, and for a brief moment he catches your attention for any number of reasons. It could be the way he's dressed, it could be his height or his race, or just the fact that he's the only person in your path of vision, whatever, but your attention is caught by somebody. Step 2, you sort that person into an existing category in your brain. Again, this is an automatic process that we go through to make sense of the world. So you see that this young man is wearing a backpack and he's looking at a cell phone, and your brain automatically sorts them into the category of college student. This isn't a conscious thing, that's just where your brain puts them in this automatic process. The next 2 steps are where this process can lead to prejudices, okay, and to unfairness. Step 3, now that you've sorted them into a category, you recall your generalizations about that category. Now let's say that you are a grumpy old person who lives next door to a bunch of college students who are rowdy and annoying. And so since you have sorted that person into the category of college student, your generalizations about college students are that they're loud and disrespectful, and that they're lazy about their studies, and that they party all the time, and that, things like that. Let's say those are your generalizations about college students. The 4th step in the stereotyping process is that you then apply those generalizations to this individual. And that's where it goes wrong. You need to interrupt this process in the step 3 or 4 area. So you need to be conscious when you're doing this so that you can consciously interrupt this process, especially between stages 3 and 4, before stage 4. Because in stage 4, what you do is you take those generalizations, like college students are lazy and disrespectful, and you apply them to this individual. You apply them to this kid who's walking across campus. You decide that he must be like that. And that's where the process goes wrong, because you have not bothered to look at that person truly as an individual or to engage with them in any kind of authentic way. So I invite you to think about this 4-step process and kind of try to catch yourself when you're doing it as you move through the world and as you move through life. And again, it's something our brains do automatically to make sense of the world. It's not necessarily bad in theory, but in practice, it can really go wrong at that last stage. So I invite you to spend some time thinking about that. That's our lecture for Chapter 5. Please read the chapter thoroughly. Contact me if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.